Very good. So someone said this morning, back to school. So that's what it feels like a little bit, to be doing some study. Right? Sometimes with our Dharma practice, we forget that we're active learners in this spiritual path, and that we actually need to do this kind of study to make progress. When we study and put what we study into practice, the path becomes very swift. We make real progress. When we don't reflect and don't improve our knowledge, then we kind of just plod along a little bit. So this is one of the meritorious deeds that we can do, investigating and studying the Dhamma. And there's a sutta that I can half remember, which shows I didn't study it very well, where the qualities of the heavenly beings, they practice generosity, they practice ethics, they practice mental development, but one of the things that distinguishes them is their study of the Dhamma. So they study the Dhamma, and this is how heavenly beings end up in the heavens. So they kind of pay attention and put what they learn into practice. And so as students on the path, have we learnt our lessons? And the answer is probably not very much, otherwise we wouldn't still be here, right? So in Buddhism, of course, for those who aren't Buddhist or are maybe Buddhish, there is a concept of rebirth. And this rebirth isn't just once or twice. This is over and over and over and over and over and over again, back to an unknowable beginning. And the Buddha, when he looked back in those few moments before his enlightenment, looking back at life after life after life that he'd lived, he said he couldn't discern a beginning. So that shows that there's quite a lot. And you suppose that if he sat there long enough, he might have been able to go back and back and back and back. But he said, no, there's no beginning that can be discerned. And so this really puts into perspective the nature of our predicament. You know, you think you've got a few problems at work or in your relationship, but this is just a tiny little problem compared to the big picture, not only of the suffering you'll experience in this life, but of the suffering that you've experienced over and over and over again in previous lives. And even though this life and previous lives, of course, they have there's happiness to them, right? There's happiness to be had in this life. But you'll still experience those things that we looked at yesterday. You'll still experience old age, sickness, death, separation, and the results of your actions, karma. And so in today's sutta class, we're looking at a few suttas that give us this big perspective. So a sutta is the teachings of the Buddha. And so we're going to start on page 7 with this sutta called the Pugala Sutta. And this is in the Samyutta Nikaya in a collection called the Anamatagga Samyutta. And this is a collection of verses, I think Bhante Sujata has translated as linked discourses with no known beginning, unknowable beginnings. And so this is, of course, a reference to the Buddha looking back and back and not being able to see a beginning. And so you see in the first sentence here, there's a little ... And this means that there's been an abbreviation made on this text, that there's some repetition from a previous text. And in the Samyutta Nikaya we see this very frequently because it's a group of texts that have been collected because they're quite similar to each other. And so often there's phrases that repeat and repeat, and to save ink and even even in digital formats, it's the same thing. We abbreviate it. And so there is a beginning, it seems, but we've lost the beginning, and that's why I'm going to go here to find the beginning of this this little verse sequence. So it begins with mendicants, that means monks and nuns. Transmigration, rebirth, has no known beginning. And I'll just read to you this extra bit. No first point is found of sentient beings roaming and transmigrating, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. So this is that part that is missing. It's quite an important part. No first point is found, no beginning is found. And there's just these sentient beings roaming, wandering through samsara. Why? Because they're hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. So this is the big problem. And when I say, have you learnt your lessons? No, we're still hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. And through several suttas yesterday and several conversations, we acknowledge the difficulty in learning our lesson. Even though we know we're going to die, we don't really believe it. Even though we know that we're going to get old, we like to somehow hope against hope that we'll stay young forever. Even though we know we're going to get sick, we have this illusion of health, even though our bodies are falling apart. And so it's very hard to see. It's very hard to learn these lessons. And that's why this concept of Samvega, which the Buddha praised as something which can help you develop energy in your practice, to re-inspire you, to reaffirm your understanding of these truths. That's why it's so important for us to develop these insights into these truths and to incorporate them in our practice so that we chip away at that ignorance over and over and over and over and over again. And the Buddha did this with his disciples too, constantly teaching them these things, old age, sickness and death, and giving them different ways to think about this problem. It's one of the reasons I love the Anamataka Sutra, and I might read some more of the verses to you, because they are full of really clear similes and analogies. And the Buddha was such a masterful teacher. You know, one of these perhaps will really trigger some sort of samvega in you, some sort of urgency in your practice. So who knows, maybe it's this one. This is one of my favourites, that's why I included it. So remember, there's transmigration with no beginning, beings hindered by ignorance, fettered by craving. One person roaming and transmigrating for an eon would amass a heap of bones the size of this Mount Vepula. So this is a mountain in India, in the Gangetic Plain. It's one of the mountains around Varanasi. And so, you know, we've got some bones in our body, and doesn't look like much. How many bones, how many bodies do you think it would take to create a mountain? Quite a lot. Yeah? It's not one of those jelly bean competitions where you have to guess. But I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Revenant with Leonardo. Yeah? There's a picture there, and I often use this when I talk about this sutta. There's a picture of in the movie. It's set in America in like the 1800s or something, and they hunt bison. Bison, you know, those big kind of like kind of strange cows, giant cows, yeah. And so at that time there was millions and millions of bison roaming across the American plains, and they killed a whole heap. And there's this pile of bones, and it's really striking when you see a human next to this pile of bones. It's actually based on a real photograph of this slaughter of bisons, and you know, they just kind of throw the bones on. And we know this is kind of what happened throughout human history too. In Australia we have these things called middens, which are where the First Nations people of Australia for 40,000 years, 60,000 years, they would go fishing, collect things like oyster shells and just toss them in a pile. You have these huge piles where humans have been for countless generations. And so, it's possible this accumulation, one by one by one, leads to a mass, right? And so we can imagine one body after the next, one body after the next, one body after the next, becoming this huge pile of bones. It's a very graphic image. It's very arresting. It's obviously designed to trigger some sort of emotional response, right? And so the Buddha says, why is that? Why have you accumulated this many bones? Well, transmigration has no known beginning. And there's beings wandering about in samsara, fettered by ignorance and a slave to craving. And he goes on to say, asking us if we've learnt our lesson, that this is quite enough. This is quite enough for you to become disillusioned, dispassionate, and freed regarding all conditions. So he's asking, why haven't you learnt? Why haven't you learnt? Why haven't you escaped from this cycle of suffering? The words here, disillusioned, this is nibbida, dispassionate, viraga, and freed, vimutti. So why haven't we learnt our lesson? It's because we're still fettered by ignorance and a slave to craving. We want things, we want bodies, we want more life, we want continued existence. And so this is what keeps us stuck here. And so in this Samyutta there's so many beautiful similes like this that are powerful. Another one is, he asked the monks, what do you think, monks? Which is greater? The amount of tears that you have shed, life after life, grieving for loved ones, or the amount of water in the oceans? And the monks are very clever. They're like, well, we know your teaching, so it's going to be the tears that we have shed. And she's like, very good, right? And another one where the Buddha says, which do you think is greater? The amount of blood that you have shed whilst being decapitated as punishment for crimes that you've done, or the amount of water in the ocean. And the monks are like, well, we know your teaching, so... And so this is just like one kind of death, having your head chopped off. And then in this Samyutta, there's other things like there's no being that has not been your mother or your father or your sister or your daughter or your son or your brother. There's no being that hasn't been related to us in some way, which again shows this vast scale that the Buddha is working in. Doesn't that put things into perspective a little? We think we have so many problems in this life. And this is why the Buddha's insights are so profound, because he had the ability to see things that are hidden to us, and he revealed them. Sometimes it's quite difficult for us to understand these truths or to get on board with these ideas. And in Australia and many Western countries, a lot of people don't believe in rebirth and they don't believe in karma. And so how should we approach it for people like that? It's one thing to say, oh, countless lives. If you don't believe in that, where's the motivation to act? Where's the motivation to do good? And of course, at the time of the Buddha, he also had conversations with people who didn't believe in rebirth. And yet he still said, there is rebirth. But he said, even if you don't believe in rebirth, you can see in this very life the results of your actions. So if you do good, then you get good results. If you get angry and yell at someone, then you see the result that happens from that. You see in this life even people being punished for things that they've done. So this is how the Buddha taught, saying, okay, leave that aside. Look at this life. See if you can see the suffering in this life. See if you can see the benefit of doing good, acting good in this life. However, it's important to acknowledge, at least, that when we take away these core aspects of the Buddha's teaching, as happens in some places, such as secular Buddhism, mindfulness training, and some like retreat systems where they present purely meditation without any of the larger Buddhist context. It's important to acknowledge that over and over and over again, the Buddha claimed that these kinds of insights were central to his enlightenment. The concept of rebirth and suffering was central to his enlightenment. And so it's maybe somewhat problematic when we have people claiming to be Buddhists who are secular, or people who practice meditation from the Buddhist tradition without taking on board the profound teachings that are central to the Buddha's discourse. So it becomes slightly problematic, I think. It's not that you should force anyone to believe anything. Of course, we have to investigate these things ourselves. And it's difficult to see how these things are true, right? And so one of the questions yesterday was, well, how do I believe in rebirth? It's not something that I'm going to try to convince you of. But there are ways that we can investigate in ourselves. And a lot of the research that's being done on rebirth is especially looking at younger kids who seems like they still have some memories of the past. I remember seeing some things that really freaked their parents out, like little kids saying, "That's not my name," and you're not my mother. My name is this. My mother is this person. And like the parents kind of like, I've got no idea where this is coming from. Or kids talking about their baby brother who doesn't exist. And one of the things that always inspires me is the man named Dharma. Do you know Dharma? As a little boy, like I think maybe 2 or 3 years old, he started spontaneously chanting the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. I know, right? How long have we been trying to memorize that for years? And here comes a 2-year-old, does it perfectly. And he chanted, paritas last 20, 30 minutes. And when you hear him chanting, it's so beautiful. Have you ever heard the chanting of Dhammaruwan? He has the most beautiful voice, and it's so lyrical. Maybe you can play some later. And he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows the words, he knows the phrasing, he knows where to pause. And sometimes in these chants, there's just one word that changes. And he knew that one word. And I always forget, but he knew it, And so we look sometimes at things like child prodigies to develop this kind of, well, where does that come from? How is that kid, 3-year-old, playing, Mozart? How does that happen? And even some of the experiences that we have as young kids, there was one guy who's quite well known, and there's lots of YouTube videos about it. He grew up in a family in America, and he had these really strong, intense recollections of being a World War II fighter pilot. And his recollections were so clear, he gave a name. He named the place, the island where he was fighting, the ship that was sunk, I think, or the ship that he served on or something like that, and his own name. And his parents were Christian. And, these stories were being told by him, they didn't know what to do. And eventually they started investigating, and they found out actually there was a person, and all of those details were correct. And he'd been shot down, and he kept on having these really strong visions of dying. And so later on in his life, they actually took him back to the place where he died. And, he said that a lot of these memories since that young time, he's forgotten a lot about them. And the same with Dhammaruwan, he forgot that chanting over time. And so this is perhaps one of the reasons it's so difficult for us to have any conviction in things like rebirth, because obviously over time, those memories disappear, they fade. We're in this body, we're getting used to this situation now. We grow, and that previous existence becomes more like a dim memory. Only the very strong tendencies, the very strong traces of our character and our karma, only those things remain. But the world is fascinating and interesting and spooky and weird. And so at the very least, I just try to keep an open mind about these things. And you hear stories sometimes of people talking about things like trauma, and they don't know where it's come from, very strong memories and things like that. They don't know where it's come from. So who knows what the explanation for these sorts of things might be. But even if you don't believe in rebirth, the fact is we're all going to die. And so it doesn't matter who we've been, it doesn't matter how many times you were royal in your past life. Everyone wants to be royal. It doesn't matter what happened to you in the past, whether there was some trauma or some pleasure, whatever. What matters is what you're doing right here, right now, with your life, how you're making your present, and what kind of future you're creating. And so that's what matters. The Buddha gave that analogy, perhaps some of you know it, of a person who's been shot with an arrow. Right? So if you get shot with an arrow, you don't go around saying, hey, who shot me? I'd like to have a chat. I would like to also know what kind of wood is the arrow made from, and the feather, what kind of feather was used. No, you go to a hospital and you get the arrow removed, right? So in the same way, we don't need to ponder too much about what kind of person we were in the past, or what happened to us, or why did this thing happen, or whatever. Instead, we really need to focus on taking ourselves to the spiritual hospital and making sure that we get treated and sort ourselves out, right? So this is what we can learn from these kind of suttas, is the big problem that we've had in the past. And then the point of the Buddha asking us to imagine these things, like mountains of bones or oceans full of blood. The point of this is to say, this is quite enough for you to become disillusioned, dispassionate, and freed regarding all conditions. So one of my favourite things is to go and do death contemplations in the cemetery. This is kind of like monks' idea of fun. And so sometimes I take people along with me and we do death contemplations. There's a beautiful old cemetery in Sydney, which is from the Victorian period, and there's these gravestones made out of sandstone, and they're all kind of leaning, and it looks very decrepit and haunted, and everything is just falling apart. Cemeteries are actually really expensive things to run, and the problem is that all your customers are dead, so they're not paying anymore. And not only are your customers dead, but the people who put them there are also dead, right? And everyone involved in making that gravestone, digging the grave, everyone else is dead too. And the gravestones are really great because they have these texts on them. So they have, I'm not sure, I've seen some Malay graves here. But I think probably most Buddhists go for cremation, right? And, pardon? Mixture. Oh, okay. And I've seen in some of the temples here the urns with people's remains, which I think is really nice. But these graves, I'm not sure if you're familiar with these kind of graves. Maybe you've seen Christian graveyards or some of the colonial graveyards. There's usually a little bit of information, like our beloved mother. It's like, this person was loved and cared for, right? Our beloved mother at rest. And then their name, Marjorie Daniels. And then their age 23. And the years that they lived. Sometimes with these Victorian graves, you even get the cause of death. Died of a tropical disease. One of my favourites was died being hit by a tram. And it's like so specific and so weird. And yet they thought, well, better put that on there. And then maybe there'll be a little bit of verse, maybe something from the Bible about passing or about going to heaven. And on the grave there'll be some sort of imagery, like a lily, which is a symbol of death, or an hourglass, time running out, a dove, which is like the heavenly ghost, I think, or some flowers. Sometimes there'll be like a draped urn, like the veil that separates us from the other world, this kind of veil over this urn. Or when someone was young, a column that has been broken. So it's like, the idea of a column is it's something tall and strong, but it's been cut down in its prime. And so this going to a place like this is really inspiring because you see impermanence. This afternoon we're going to be doing a death contemplation. We're going to be imagining a corpse. So I'm kind of slowly preparing the ground. That's what we've been doing the last few days. Just getting used to the idea of, yes, there we go. So we have things like art, of these processes of life and death. One of the problems for me, I've got a background in the visual arts, is that even decaying bodies can be a little bit beautiful in some way, right? There's a kind of strange beauty to this process of decay. People are shaking their heads like, no. But for me, the smell of death is not very pleasant, and that's what I actually work with often, is the smell of the decaying corpse, because you can't make that beautiful. But I wanted to read another sutta, which I think helps put this into context, if I can find it. This idea of impermanence in a large scale, and in a way we can contemplate it without needing to take on the whole rebirth thing. I've just got to bring it up on my phone. And again, these ideas about impermanence and transitoriness, like, we know these things, right? But we still haven't learnt the lesson. Like, we're still missing something. It still hasn't affected us fully. And so that's why the Buddha always tried different strategies to try to get people like, can you get it? Can you tune into this? Can you understand it? No, really understand it. Because only when we really understand it that we are going to respond appropriately. And again, it's this very slow process of kind of chipping away at that ignorance and uncovering those things in a way that allows us to understand why we need to respond. Anyway, so I wanted to go back to that mountain that we met here in the single person sutta. And here's the Buddha staying near that mountain and talking to the monks. And he says, "Mendicants, transmigration has no known beginning, no first point of sentient beings roaming and transmigrating, shrouded by ignorance and fettered by craving can be found. Once upon a time, this Mount Vepula was known as Panchinavangsa, and at that time people were known as Tiwaras. The lifespan of the Tiwaras was 40,000 years. It took them 4 days to climb Mount Vepula and 4 days to descend. At that time, Kakusanda, the Blessed One, this is a previous Buddha, arose in the world. Kakusanda had a fine pair of chief disciples named Vidura and Sanjiva. See, monks, this mountain's name has vanished. So, too, has that Buddha become fully extinguished. So impermanent are conditions, so unstable are conditions, so unreliable are conditions. This is quite enough for you to become disillusioned, dispassionate, and freed regarding all conditions. Once upon a time, this Mount Vepula was known as Vankaka, and at that time the people were known as Rohitasas. The lifespan of the Rohitasas was 30,000 years. At that time, Kongamana, the Blessed One, a perfectly enlightened Buddha, arose in the world. Kongamana had a fine pair of disciples named Biyosa and Uttara. See, mendicants, this mountain's name has vanished. That Buddha has become fully extinguished. So too, these conditions are impermanent. And so on and so on. He keeps talking about these different mountain names for the same mountain and the different beings who lived there, the different times and places. So this is something that we know, right? Like Malaysia wasn't always called Malaysia. It had another name, right? And even before then, another name, different people. And before that, dinosaurs. And so the Buddha finishes up with this verse, "Oh, conditions are impermanent. Their nature is to rise and fall. Having arisen, they cease. Their stilling is true bliss." So these are verses that, the Anicca Vata Sankhara verses. Maybe you do this in your chanting practice. So these are the kinds of verses that we chant when someone has died, and especially at funerals. That conditions are impermanent, but stilling is bliss. And so we don't have to die to experience, the impermanence of conditions. We don't have to attain enlightenment to experience the stilling of these conditioned phenomena. We can get a little taste of that stilling, a little taste of that peace through our meditation practice. And often when we contemplate death or impermanence, you might think that the mind will get really agitated and kind of a bit nervous and apprehensive, but often you find that you just experience this peace, that for some reason this calms you down somehow. Maybe it's because your mind just kind of thinks, well, why am I struggling? Why don't I just give up and let go? So anyway, we know that this world, this planet, has gone through many different processes. We know that our countries have been different kingdoms and realms, and different people lived here, and all sorts of changes have occurred. And yet, for some reason, we're obsessed by this idea of permanence. We spend our entire lives preserving what we have, and this, of course, makes it difficult to see that bigger picture. So these are just some ways that we can start thinking about how we actively participate in this process of delusion, covering up, refusing to see, not seeing clearly what's happening. And that's our problem. We're fettered by ignorance. So, I'll keep moving. I'm going to skip the next one. I think I might save it for tonight. It's like a bedtime story. And we'll go to a similar sutta that is one of my favourites. And so again, we're talking about vast time scales. And again, it's the Buddha telling a story from the past about a sage named Araka. He doesn't say that this was a Buddha, like in the previous sutta we looked at. He says that this was a great teacher, and that this great teacher had many students, and his name was Araka. And so we'll go through it together. Once upon a time, there was a teacher called Araka. He was a religious founder and was free of sensual desire. He had many hundreds of disciples, and he taught them like this: Brahmins, life as a human is short, brief, and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life, for no one born can escape death. So he sounds like a lot of fun to be around, right? Life is short, brief, and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. So the previous sentence, of course, we hear that he was free of sensual desire. So he's free from the mistaken view that these things are pleasurable. It's easy when we still have sensual desire, to think that that's where happiness lies. But this sage and other teachers have seen through these sensual pleasures. Why? Because they too are short, brief, and fleeting. They're not a secure place to place. They're not a secure place to put our happiness, because it's so fragile. And because of that, those sensual pleasures are suffering. And so here we see that this person, this teacher Araka, he's free of sensory pleasure, and so he understands that these things are suffering, and that our human life too is suffering. So it doesn't sound like very like a very fun kind of thing to think about. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing you want to use as your opening line at a party. But what these kind of teachings do is help us balance out our tendency to seek happiness in places where we can't really find it, or to think that this rebirth after rebirth, or this life with its suffering, is where we can find happiness. when perhaps freedom from this happiness, as the Buddhist freedom from this suffering, is what we should be looking for. And this is why he says, think about this and wake up. See through this illusion. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life, for no one born can escape death. So he's obviously exhorting, right? Think about this. Wake up. It's like he wants to kind of slap you in the face. Wake up. And this is like, wake up from your dream. Wake up from your slumber. Sleep is, of course, a metaphor for ignorance. You're asleep. You don't know what's going on. The Buddha is the awakened one. And so Araka gives a series of 7 similes, and these are really beautiful, and maybe some of them will be familiar to you. So he says, it's like a drop of dew on a grass tip. When the sun comes up, it quickly evaporates and doesn't last long. In the same way, life as a human is like a dewdrop. It's brief and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life, for no one born can escape death. So that's the first simile, right? So it's a pretty powerful simile. And in Buddhism, of course, we're quite accustomed to like the lotus leaf with the dewdrop on it, or the dewdrop on the lotus flower, right? It's so beautiful. And you see it on all the meditation posters. And it's like become this very asceticized image associated with Buddhism. Beautiful. And we understand, it's about impermanence, but we don't think, suffering, We don't think that's us. And so this is a really powerful image. And when we see that dewdrop on a lotus leaf, of course, it's not just, this is pretty, this means Buddhism. This is impermanence. This is, your life is short. What are you going to do about it? There's this kind of urgency that should be behind that. Wake up. So the next simile is like when the rain falls heavily, the bubbles, water bubbles, quickly vanish and don't last long. In the same way, human life is like a water bubble. So you know when it rains, you see the little bubbles that pop up. They literally kind of come, pop, and they're gone. Pop, and they're gone. That's like us, right? So brief. And when I go to those cemeteries and look at those gravestones, sometimes it's little kids who have died a week old, 2 weeks old. Sometimes it's a child of 7. Sometimes it's a person of 17, 24, 35, 77, whatever it is. The fact is, it's always going to be too brief, this human life. It's like a line drawn in the water. It vanishes quickly and doesn't last long. In the same way, life as a human is like a line drawn in the water. It's like a mountain river travelling far, flowing fast, carrying all before it. It doesn't turn back, not for a moment, not for a second, not for an instant, but runs, rolls, flows on. In the same way, life as a human is like a mountain river. This is a very powerful analogy. Rivers only go one way, right? And our human life only goes one way. We're going to get old. We're going to die. Can't go the opposite way. You can't get younger. It's like a strong man who's formed a glob of spit on the tip of his tongue. It's easy to spit that out. That's us. We're the spit. We get spat into the world, and then we get spat out of it again. And so the first 5 of these images are very watery. This last one is kind of starting to get a bit disgusting, right? It's kind of like spit. Like we're just like a little spit. That's what it's like. That's how worthless we are. That's how little we matter to the world. We're just like a bit of spit spat out. Suppose there was an iron cauldron that had been heated all day. If you tossed a lump of meat in it, it would quickly vanish and not last long. I think this is usually translated as a slither of meat or a sinew. So it's like a very small bit. You heat a pan and you throw it in, it just kind of sizzles and vanishes, right? That's us. We're the lump of meat thrown into the pan, we just sizzle, and we're gone. It's like a cow being led to slaughter. Every step she comes closer to the slaughter, closer to death. In the same way, life as a human is like a cow being slaughtered. It's brief and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life, for no one born can escape death. And it goes on to say, at that time, human beings had a lifespan of 60,000 years. And this next sentence is a bit troubling. Girls could be married at 500 years. So I think the Buddha was just trying to put the age in context about how the humans grew and how long they lasted. And human beings only had 6 afflictions: cold, heat, hunger, and thirst, and the need to defecate and urinate. So this is maybe some sort of perhaps legendary or mythical past where there was some sort of purer being that wasn't afflicted by other defilements. These are the only afflictions. But even though humans were so long-lived with so few afflictions, Araka still taught in this way. Life as a human is short, brief and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life, for no being born can escape death. So this repetition, of course, is a feature of the suttas, a feature of the oral tradition that these teachings were given in. They weren't written down. You didn't have a photocopy in your hand. You didn't have Google to help you search. You didn't have a book. You had to remember these teachings, and one of the ways that made it easy to remember was to have this repetition. And one of the benefits of that repetition is that it really sinks in. Each time you repeat it, like, yes, yes. And so it's quite different, a very different way of learning from perhaps the way we learn today. Like when we read, like the tendency would be like just to skip, right? Look at all the ellipses I put in there for 5 out of the 7 similes, because otherwise it would take up a lot of paper. But that changes it, right? Somehow. But even if I'd left them in there, you would have just read the first bit and then skipped to the next bit anyway. It's like, why haven't we learnt our lesson? We keep on skipping the important bit. So, what to do? So, over and over again, we need to condition the mind more and more to see these things. And so what I like to do with a sutta like this is to ponder it a little bit, to think about it, to let it land in my mind so that I can percolate and synthesize this information, make it relevant to me somehow. Did any of those similes stand out to you? Which one? And why? Which one? The spit, yeah? The spit, right? For me, I think I'm quite immune to the dewdrop analogy, having seen so many Dharma books, so many Dharma posters with dewdrops. Ceased to have an impact on my mind, but the cow being led to slaughter, I mean, that's something you actually see, right? And that's something that I have this direct kind of relationship to when you're sitting in traffic behind what do they call it, a meat truck, a cattle truck where the cattle are all stuffed into the back of a truck, and you see the whites of their eyes, they're terrified, they're being thrown around the back of a truck, they don't know what's going on, they don't know where they're going, they're scared. This, that kind of experience in front of me is really powerful. It makes me understand, this is life, this is suffering, this is my life too, I'm just kind of getting rocked about, and one day I'll be gone. So how to let these things affect us. So what I thought we'd do is we're going to take a few moments to have a stretch and maybe stand up, turn around 3 times, or stretch your legs, have a yawn, and then we're going to do a quick contemplation based on these similes. Okay? So take a few moments to just stretch. Don't leave. We're only going to be here another 20 minutes or so. So we're running out of time, you see? So you can make yourself comfortable, use a chair if you need to, that's fine. Or sitting comfortably. Close the eyes. And let's just have a few moments to just settle back in. So you allow the mind just to settle again, coming back to that place of calm and quietness. And so we're contemplating impermanence. This life is short, brief, fleeting. There is suffering and distress. Think about this. Wake up. This life is like a dewdrop on a blade of grass. Visualize this image, the green grass, the dewdrop glistening in the early morning dawn. And watch as the sun rises, it gets hotter. Watch how that dewdrop quickly dries up, vanishes. My life, too, is like that dewdrop. So short, so brief, so fleeting. It cannot last. There's suffering, distress. Think about this. Wake up. How are you living? This life is like a water bubble in the rain. It pops into existence and almost straight away vanishes, gone. My life too, so short, so brief. Think about this. Wake up. Like a line drawn in the water. As soon as it appears, it vanishes. My life will always be too brief, too short. My life is fleeting. Wake up. Like a fast, flowing river. That rolls on, flowing in only one direction. So fast, so unstoppable. In the same way, my life will only go one way, towards old age, sickness, and death. Think about this. Wake up to this. How are you living your life? This human life is like a glob of spit spat out. We're spat into this world. That spit quickly dries up in the sun. Think about this. Wake up. Or like a tiny slither of meat thrown into a hot pan, sizzling, vanishing. My life is short, brief, fleeting. Think about this. Wake up. Like a cow being led to slaughter. Every step bringing it closer and closer to death. Just like me. Every day, every hour, every minute brings me closer and closer to death. think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life, for no one born can escape death. And so for the next few minutes, just reflecting on these 7 similes. The dewdrop on the blade of grass, the water bubble, the line drawn in the water, the fast flowing river, the glob of spit, the slither of meat in a hot pan, the cow being led to slaughter. So allow your mind to wander through these similes. Allow these similes to affect your mind. Think about this. See if it wakes you up, remembering that no being that is born can escape death. Okay, how was that? Yes? Did it help make this a little bit clearer? Yeah? So doing this kind of contemplation is one way that I use to remember the suttas. So I give myself some time to sit and explore the imagery of the sutta so that I can remember it. So I wonder if any of you can remember the 7 similes. There'll be a test later on. And maybe you've got a simile that is something that works for you, something else that makes you think about this impermanence. Like the hole in your shoe, or that last, like a coffee container that's just got like a few grains left of coffee in. It's like impermanent, or something that makes you aware of this. So it's important that in our lives that we kind of find our own similes that matter to us, something that we can see this truth in a way that is personal to us, that means something to us as individuals. But enough of that, we're going to have lunch. It's quite a segue, isn't it? At 12 o'clock. And so we've got half an hour to kind of chill out and do some other things before we eat.